Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? China has finally admitted they are now in the midst of a second wave of CCP virus infections, although they insist upon calling it COVID-19. This is the same concern that has been expressed by many other national health agencies such as the CDC. It follows from China's rather authoritarian crackdown on travel, movement, and any number of methods to control the spread of the virus, some of these being more questionable than others. The worst of which was experienced in Wuhan. China appears to be trying to placate the world by having the same person who helped expose the 2003 outbreak of SARS report on this. In their words, it's not better than the foreign countries, I think, at the moment. Further, the same spokesperson has admitted that the cover-up in Wuhan did occur. They claim that the early reporting was significantly undervalued and that they did not give full figures or accounts of what was happening. They rather optimistically believe that the figures coming out of China after the lockdown occurred are accurate. That's an interesting take from the same person who exposed the cover-up of SARS, but sure. While China has been busy trying to make up for ground they lost in hiding the truth of what occurred in Wuhan and then the wider China, a 17-year-old boy has been developing a tracking ad that will describe the events, particularly the statistics, of what the CCP virus has caused. This app has been so successful that he's been offered millions of dollars to include ads in it that would then make him considerably rich. When asked why he did it, he explained that nobody else was and that there was clearly a desire for information. He's also expressed an interest in possibly simply shutting down the app as it is and creating an archive page describing the events that have unfolded during the outbreak of the CCP virus. Remembering this is a 17-year-old high school student. At least one offer of $8 million was made, and others were made, and he thinks he could have even made his own ads and profited from that considerably more, but declined all of these options in order to make the site streamlined and more efficient. In his own words, the upside has been that he may not have money out of it, but he has all the connections to go forward with many other ideas, whether these are job offers, projects of his own, and similar. The perfect example of the expression, no good deed goes unpunished. Next we have the new guidelines issued out of the UK. The UK government has decided that it's possible that a sudden loss of the ability to smell could indeed be a symptom of the CCP virus. They've now issued an advisory, perhaps, that from today all individuals should self-isolate if they develop a new contagious cough, fever, or anosmia. Anosmia being the term for the loss of smell. The initial evidence for anosmia to be included was primarily anecdotal and therefore not the most reliable source of information. As a consequence, it took time for a proper study to go out, and the first one came from Iran. It involved 10,000 people, and it found a correlation between the possibility of losing your sense of smell and the CCP virus. Later, a second large study was found that produced similar results. Unfortunately, like other studies, there have been limitations to this finding, the most significant of which is a wide variation on the particular variable we're looking at. In China, 5% of patients lost their sense of smell or had it impaired. In France, you had 86%, in Italy 64%, and in America 68%. This inconsistent finding makes it hard to tell just how closely related the two are. Is the anosmia an indication of early, late, or random stage infection? Could it be subject to individual variation based on their genome, We simply don't know yet. We can establish that there is some link, but we're not entirely clear about what that link is and why. Next, we have some research showing an interesting metaphor of how vaccines are being discussed across social media. Vaccines are an especially important issue when it comes to the CCP virus and the hope that we will have a vaccine available in the relatively near future. It's the willingness of the general population to take up this vaccine and therefore be able to resist the disease itself that is so important, whether that is the CCP virus or other diseases that we can at the moment treat. Think whooping cough, measles, even the annual flu. The study looked at over 100 million Facebook users, over 37 countries. That is a large data set and would be difficult to visualize, which is why it's been described as more of a metaphor. The researchers used a method that is found with physics and tried to describe the relationships between a variety of different groups, what they have described in a way as a battlefield. The image you can see here has the red dots as the antivaxxers, the blue dots as provaccine, and the green dots are an unknown cohort. Those who don't necessarily have a clearly defined position on vaccines. Researchers describe a handful of things we can take away from this immediately. The first is that the pro-vaccine group is by far and away much larger than the anti-vaxxers. But that is probably the most positive thing that can be said about this for them. The downsides are that the anti-vaxxer groups are in the right places. They are far more spread out and networking far more efficiently than the pro-vaccine groups. This means that they're engaging in the right places at the right time to try and swing people away from being willing to vaccinate themselves and their children to being questioning and skeptical of it, which in and of itself is not bad, but being skeptical for the sake of being skeptical is not particularly useful, especially when it's based on false information. With the two groups distributed the way they are, the anti-vaccine group will be able to push their arguments and convince more people more readily because there is no contrary information available. There's nothing to point out, this study they're citing, it's been disproven or it's based on false data, so on and so forth. Instead, they're simply told, here's the information, and without the knowledge or ability to question it, they can swing a large proportion of the population away from the proven, medically verified, statistically valid arguments and into these areas where anecdotes and woo seem to be the predominant means of convincing people. Fortunately, that's about the whole of the news we have on the CCP virus this week that's worth discussing. But we do have an interesting case study that's worth bringing up, or more like a case report than a case study, and it describes the world's favourite drug, caffeine. Caffeine being found everywhere, from coffee, tea, chocolate, soft drink and energy drinks. Caffeine can be found in many places and in many forms once it's been separated out from a larger molecule. By itself, in these beverages and foods, it's not very bad. You'll get a kick out of it, but it won't cause you much harm. You would need to consume a lot of coffee, primarily, in order to get the negative effects that you would observe from consuming an excess amount of caffeine. There are generally limits on this, and as a result, buying caffeine in a bulk form has been difficult to obtain in most countries, and generally banned. Many of these bans came on the heels of a number of deaths associated with caffeine toxicity. It also was closely associated with the use of caffeine as a supplement to gain muscle mass when exercising. Those bans are an interesting association since the amount of caffeine in these supplements was significantly higher than what is in coffee. According to the case report, consuming 1 to 2 grams of caffeine in a single or acute dose could have toxic effects. Consuming more than 5 grams will have fatal consequences. This is because it gives blood caffeine concentrations of greater than 80 milligrams a litre. They then describe one particular case study and how their blood caffeine levels were 147.1 milligrams a litre 7 hours after the initial dose. Remembering that caffeine has a half-life. The same case study then goes on to explain the method they used to treat this overdose. Specifically, they describe it because there is no standardized method available. What they used was a combination of molecule that absorbs and catches fat-soluble products and locks them away, plus hemodialysis, which then removes this net that would catch the caffeine. They're two existing and well-known treatments that used in conjunction could very effectively help the possible increasing incidence of caffeine poisoning. If you're looking at ways to get your heart rate up in order to exercise, there are other options, and an article in the Business Insider describes one of these: sex. Yes, they're talking about how many calories sex will burn, and whether or not there are ways to increase that, and what possible benefits might come from it. As bizarre as it is to say, there's actually been some ongoing but relatively low-level interest in the exercise nature of sex since the 1980s. That's about 40 years of research into this. In general, it's found that men will burn about 101 calories and women will burn just over 69 calories per session. That figure is, of course, based on 4.2 calories per minute for men and 3.1 calories per minute for women. And with a little bit of math, you can figure out how long they expect the average session to last, which may not line up with your experience or with the average. To keep this week's installment PG rated, we'll leave it here, but for more information, look in the description for the article from Business Insider on the calorie burning benefits of sex. While we're on the topic of relationships, let's talk about beards. If you look into any group of hipsters, you probably can't tell them apart. One thing they'll have in common is they'll all have some sort of beard and possibly a man bun. The beard is a weird phenomenon, especially among apes, as we are the only species that has developed a full-grown beard. It doesn't serve any purpose that we can identify readily, but there may be a possible reason that over millennia, humans have selected for this trait. A study coming out of the University of Utah was trying to figure out just what's happening with the beard, and there was a theory. Perhaps the beard is there to stop you from taking as much punishment when punched. From an adaptative view, this would make sense. Going back millennia, if not more, the cavemen would fight, and they would have considerable violence. If there was a way to reduce the impact to your head, then you had a better chance of remaining in the fight and coming out on top. In order to investigate this, there were issues with getting volunteers, so they had to make up a simulacrum of the human head. Their makeshift assistant involved a skull and varying grades of sheep wool and skin. This in combination with a load cell inside the skull, and a continuous drop of force using a weight, they were able to figure out just how much effect a beard, or at least a quasi-beard, would have on distributing and diminishing the blow that the assistant received. This is by no means a conclusive argument, and they intend to look into other ways of simulating a human beard properly, owing particularly to the variation in density, distribution, and general nature of the human beards across the species. There is some thought given that perhaps this all owes to the relatively violent nature of our ancestors, and that the sexually dimorphic nature of our species favoured the development of a beard on an otherwise naked ape. Although the human is a naked ape, it's not the most interesting creature out there, and sadly many of the more interesting creatures in the world have died, or more precisely, become extinct. One example of this is the Thylacine cyanophalis, otherwise known as the Tasmanian tiger. This creature became extinct in the early 20th century, and, unfortunately, all efforts to conserve it have been unsuccessful. As a consequence, there is almost nothing known about this particular species, other than the relative location in which it lived. There is perhaps 3 minutes of footage available to the world in its entirety of this particular species, and just recently we were able to add 21 seconds onto that. Consider, 21 seconds is a massive improvement on what we already have for a species we know almost nothing about, but best of all, it includes some sound. Speaking of the unknown and unknowable, it turns out some sections of the Dead Sea Scrolls that were thought to be blank and have no content of any value actually have hidden content. Now this is not surprising considering what they are and the way in which they were found. They're ancient religious texts that were generally hidden because they were considered questionable or antithetic to the accepted stories of Jesus. Finding information here could be useful in helping to piece together some of the missing parts of history that may or may not be included in the overall documents that were otherwise incomplete until now because we didn't have all the content. Looking at history and possibly going into the future, we have a position where we might be replacing the quintessential sheepdog or herding dog with Boston Dynamics' robot dog. Yes, Boston Dynamics' rather disconcerting looking robot dog has now been herding sheep in New Zealand. That might seem like a strange choice. Why a robot and why New Zealand? Well, it's very simple. They need to test its ability to operate in the environment, and New Zealand has a suitable environment for that testing. It's both rugged and variable, going from the warm summer through a cold winter. There are mountains and plains aplenty. As Boston Dynamics explains, the reason you might want a robot dog like this is they can go out and explore the field, check on crops and animals, while you're in a safe, comfortable location hundreds of kilometers away. They're able to travel effectively along ground that is otherwise difficult to traverse both for a human and for a dog, but the robot can manage either way, and it doesn't require any particular support beyond ensuring its battery will last long enough to get to the location and back. Going now from the ground to space, we have some interesting phenomena that's coming up. The particular event in question is called the solar minimum, and if you pay attention to any of the more creative individuals out there that have a little bit of knowledge about what's coming up, you might be hearing doomsday predictions. There are a variety of less than reputable news sources that have been promoting this idea. The solar minimum is a normal part of the sun's 11-year cycle. It's not unexpected, it's not surprising, and we were expecting it to come up about now anyway. This is why all of the things that are being spoken about just seem stupid. We shouldn't be expecting famine, earthquakes, or floods, although apparently fire and disease have already hit. The reason for this is simple. We've had 24 solar cycles already, and while we don't know exactly when it occurs, we know that it is a roughly 11-year cycle. Knowing that it was going to occur between 2019 and 2020 meant that predictions could be put out as to what effect it might have. And the things we do know involve the sun's magnetic field and a few other things that will change. Things that shouldn't have much effect on Earth in the long term, or even in the short term for that matter. Arguably, the reduction in solar flares and sunspots should actually help to minimize any possible harm coming out of the sun. That reduction occurs during the solar minimum, but as the sun comes up to that point, there is an increase in their frequency. knowing that we are now beginning to enter the minimum, we should see that slight increase in activity followed by the cessation. The only people who need to be concerned at the moment about the solar minimum are possibly astronauts who, due to the sun's magnetic field weakening, may be slightly more exposed to cosmic rays. That's about the extent that solar minimum may have on either helping or hindering humans. Speaking of being in space and astronauts, NASA has said that SpaceX's first crewed flight into space could be deploying next week. We recently mentioned how the Crew Dragon space capsule is being tested. We also drew comparisons to China's deployment of something similar. Well, it seems to be confirmed that there will be a May 27th crewed mission being deployed using SpaceX's technology. There is an arguable case to be made that anyone currently in space is in the safest position possible, where they are at least risk of being exposed to the CCP virus. This has also influenced the deployment of astronauts into space, where there has been concern about having that many staff on hand. The astronauts going, Benken and Hurley, aren't particularly concerned about that, with one saying, "Where there's a will, there's a way." The hope is, with this successful deployment, SpaceX can carry on with the other 5 launches it's set to have over the next few years. SpaceX and Boeing are both each supposed to deploy 6 crewed voyages over the next few years that will allow America to once again have independent access to space. Over the last decade or so, they've had to increasingly rely on foreign assets, specifically buying seats on Soyuz rockets to get their astronauts into space. Having their own access means that America can once again begin exploring space as they did in the 1960s and onwards. The space race may once more be back on, and hopefully we'll achieve as much this time as we did then. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions below.